Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Now, tonight, a special episode focusing on the power of music to transform lives and the untapped power of the music industry itself. Here to answer your questions, a panel of diverse artists. Conductor, composer and founder of the Choir of Hard Knocks, Jonathon Welch. Long-time rock legend, frontman for The Cruel Sea and Beasts of Bourbon, currently on tour in The Man in Black, Tex Perkins. One of the brightest breakout artists on the Australian music scene, Mojo Juju. Award-winning singer-songwriter Katie Noonan, and hip-hop artist from southwest Sydney, El Fresh the Lion. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. So Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. We'll receive hundreds of passionate questions tonight about the transformative power of music. Let's go to our very first question. It's from Margot McLaughlin. Margot.
I'd first of all like to thank you for having this show. We really need to talk about the power of music. Beethoven apparently declared, "Music is the entrance into the higher world of knowledge, which comprehends mankind, but which mankind cannot comprehend." Jimi Hendrix simply said, "Music is a safe kind of high." I believe everyone has a relationship to music, which undoubtedly influences how they define it. So to each of the panellists, what got you into music in the first place and what keeps you there?
Katie Noonan, we'll start with you. We'll hear from all our panellists, obviously.
Sure. Thank you for the question. What got me into music? I think my career in music was probably inevitable. I come from a long line of music makers. My grandfather was a singing clown, and I think my music career was started when I was in utero. My mum was singing opera. At the Sydney Opera House, actually, and in the same week she took my brother to see ABBA. And therein, I think, my music DNA was made, classical and pop.
You're making it a lot harder for the rest of us.
Oh, yeah, sorry. But yeah, music's always been just an integral part of my life, and I can't imagine a life without it. A life without music for me is not really a life worth living, and I keep on going back to it because it just brings me safety, it brings me love, it brings me a sense of home. Yeah.
Fresh, how about you in southwest Sydney?
Yeah, so I was born and raised southwest Sydney. My first introduction to being involved in music or participating in it, I reckon, would be as a toddler. My dad taught me how to play the tabla, Indian hand drums. And there's a picture of me in our photo album, you know, barely able to stand, but I've got a set of tabla in front of me. And, you know, that would have been my first introduction to making music or participating in it. As a Sikh, music is so much a part of who we are. We don't exist without music. It's so intrinsic to our culture and our tradition. So, you know, that was me from day one. And then...
How about hip-hop? How did those two things come together?
I was getting to it, Toadie. I was getting to it.
Sorry, mate.
But I played the trombone in the school.
I say that with a rhyme, but I didn't manage it. I
played the trombone in the primary school band. And then, which was a funny thing, bringing a trombone home, my dad kind of looked at me like, yo, what is that? And then hip-hop was introduced to me in high school. And so at that point, a lot of my friends were handing out music to me, you know, different types of music. And so through primary school, you know, it was from Backstreet Boys to Silverchair to whoever. And then when it was high school, I graduated to hip-hop, you know, and I got given a bunch of hip-hop CDs. And then from there, it was just game over. It appealed to me so much. The stories, the values, just the energy, the passion. It just spoke to me so much that I immediately was like, I have to make my own.
More on that during the program. Mojo.
I grew up with a very musical family. My grandfather played the trumpet. My grandmother she was a singer. My mum played the trombone. Lots of music. So from a really young age, I started taking music lessons, and I started with the piano, clarinet, and then finally landed on guitar because I liked to be able to like sing and travel with it.
Is it true you had a music singer who said, yeah?
I had a guitar teacher. I had a guitar teacher when I was 16 tell me, you will never be a musician. You should probably quit now. Thankfully, I just quit lessons, and then I made the rest up myself. Yeah.
This is in Dubbo, right?
Yes, in Dubbo.
So what were your sources, your main sources of musical information? Sorry, not inspiration is what I meant.
I mean, I grew up listening to Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong. They were like gods in my household. and we went to all the jazz festivals and stuff as kids. But I don't know, I just absorbed as much music as I could from everywhere. I've listened to, like, I'll listen to anything and everything, and if it's good, then I'm into it. I mean, I know good is subjective, but I'll give anything a go, you know, and I love music, and I guess that's why it's so sort of...
I can see a little bit of Billie Holiday in some of your music, I have to say. I mean...
I think she's one of the greatest vocalists
Yeah.
of all time.
Well, we're gonna experience some of your music later in the program. Tex, early days, how'd you start?
I grew up in a suburban family in Brisbane, and I had older brothers and sisters, and basically I guess I got all my the tastes that I still retain today from them. Most, I guess, practically my oldest brother, who was sort of more into rock and roll and punk rock and and alternative sort of music, which sort of came in handy when I started going out and seeing bands myself, and I made a complete ass of myself one night in public, and completely embarrassed myself, and it was absolutely shameful, my behaviour.
That didn't stop you, though, did it?
But no, about a month later, two guys approached me at a different venue and said, "You were that guy that, you know, weren't you?" And basically they said, "You want to be in a band with us?"
So is that when you figured that you could...
My music had nothing to do with music, really.
Performance.
Yes, it was a time where sort of it was more about your ability to create something happening. You know, it's like it wasn't just sort of being able. Actually, your proficiency on an instrument had very little to do with it. It was more about attitude. But really, it was more about attitude and willingness to, you know, get up there and, you know, make trouble.
Now, Jonathan, I'll move on to you. And you kind of asked a question like this before the show even started, and you answered in song. And I wonder, would you do that for us again?
Tony, thanks for putting me on the spot. Can I just say, I've never been asked to be in a band, ever. Unless, and I know, it's terribly sad. And in fact, when I
can sing.
And when I started singing in choirs, I can remember one of the choristers saying to me, it was in fact in a choir here in Sydney that I was music director of very proudly for, Sydney Gay and Lesbian Choir for about 5 years. And one of the choristers looked at me one day and she said, "Jonathan, voice 10, blend 0. So, I can't even get to sing in choirs. But my earlier influences, I'm kind of like a cross, very, very similar to Katie's, I suppose. My mother was a great musician and she was a church organist as well too, so I kind of grew up in that environment as well.
Give us a taste, Jonathan. Don't chicken out. Come on.
I'm going to keep going with the story a little bit, but I was one of those really, really weird kids. My mother made a very smart decision. I suppose music for me, in response to your wonderful question, is that music's been really the only thing that the only way I've been able to make sense of the world. I'm about to turn 61 this week, and still I find so much joy and pleasure every day out of finding about a new song, about how to do something new through music, about working with amazing different artists as well too. But my mother was very smart. When my dad left, when I was about 10 or 11, my older brother and sister, probably about to dive onto the couch watching this now. They were sent off to a technical school, but my mother sent me to a wonderful school called Melbourne Boys High School, which is still an entrance examination only school and has the most wonderful commitment to not only music but singing as part of the curriculum for over 120 years. And we'll come to that a little bit later on. But my first experiences really were and when I fell in love with singing, and I suppose I discovered this voice that I had, that when most kids in the 70s were out listening to ABBA and dancing along, I was at the back trying to out-sing Pavarotti in the backyard. So,
and how did that sound?
And that sounded something like, "Oh!" on the road to Mandalay, where the flying fishers play, and the dawn comes up like thunder out of China, cross the bay.
We sure did.
But I was singing like that when I was 16 or 17, and they kept saying, "Shut up, that kid." I was the kid that wasn't told to mime at the back. I was just told to shut up because I was too loud.
Spent too long in the bathroom. The next question's from Deborah Rodrigo.
Well, I'm definitely not going to sing, so...
Come
thanks.
on, Deborah. No, it's okay.
Thanks, Tony. I have a question for Mojo Juju and El Fresh. I want to know how you found your distinct style and voice having grown up in Australia, and what advice you'd give someone going through something similar. How can they tap in to their creativity and stay connected to community and culture?
Start with Mojo.
Whew. Big question. Thank you, though. It's taken a long time to find that voice and through a lot of experimentation. But I think ultimately the thing is about authenticity. You know, like I was saying just before the show started, I showed up to high school, my first music class, with sheet music for a song that I loved, and no one there. You know, I was really into R&B sort of before I started high school, and then when I got to high school, no one was into that. I grew up in Dubbo in New South Wales, and it just wasn't. I didn't know anyone else.
Can I interrupt you just for 1 minute?
Yeah.
Because here's a quote from a speech of yours, and if you don't mind, I'll just read it out and you can respond to it. So, growing up in the 80s and 90s in regional Australia, I stuck out like a steamed veggie at a Filipino barbecue. A queer, brown, Asian kid with a name no one could pronounce, and I hit puberty at the same time Pauline Hanson became a household name. So, my question, please explain.
Well, that sums it up pretty much. I think, you know, to quote myself, yeah. It wasn't easy, and so I did a lot of time trying to fit in, and through that I kind of discovered, yeah, I like some rock and I like some punk and I like a lot of hip hop and I like R&B and I like jazz and I like soul and I like blues. You know, I just listened to everything. And I think, you know, have acquired bits of that along the way. And so now for me, I think all I want to do is make music that's authentic to me. The artists that have truly inspired me are the ones that transcend genre. And, you know, I think goes for anyone, not just people who come from marginalised backgrounds. Anyone who's making music should make music that's authentic to them.
Let me ask you just one more quick question, and that is, how does that description of yourself, when you put it out there, how does it play when you're on tour in regional Australia?
Sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's awkward. You know, I've definitely come across towns and shows where it hasn't been well received, like people don't know what to make of me. But then it doesn't matter if there's like one person in the audience that connects with what you're doing and they see themselves represented, then to me that's worthwhile. Because when I was growing up, I didn't see myself reflected on the stage or on the screen, or like, you know, it was very rare to see someone on the television. I think that's why I kind of gravitated towards Black American music, was because it was something other than, you know, what the dominant kind of paradigm was. So it was like, yeah, to be that for someone else maybe is, I think, the most rewarding thing that I've experienced in my career.
That's a good enough reason, I think.
Yeah.
Let me go to Fresh. What do you think? And it's the same question really for you. Obviously that question was to both of you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and like, there's so many different ways to kind of tackle it, I think. But and I echo a lot of what Mojo was just sharing then, you know, in terms of the journey towards finding your style, your sound, your voice. I think, you know, the first thing that kind of comes to mind for me is, you know, music as an artist is such an introspective thing. You know, the process of writing a song means you have to look internally and you have to kind of, you know, pick your own brain and your own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And, you know, it can be such a, you know, powerful process in that way. And for me, it was a process of self-discovery. I'm so grateful that I discovered hip hop because, you know, hip hop has this culture and this tradition of valuing authenticity, you know? And so it's like, if you're trying to make music as a hip hop artist and you try to sound like somebody else, hip hop tells you, nah, I don't want to hear you.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, show me something that's authentic. Show me something that's you. And so when I discovered that, hip hop for me was such a liberating space, and it encouraged me to want to learn more about myself and wanted to specifically learn more about my own cultural background, my parents' journey in terms of their journey of migration, but also to tap into their roots and where they came from, you know, to rediscover language, because I was fluent in Punjabi growing up and then lost it, you know, during teenage years, and then wanting to relearn it, you know, and I credit hip hop in a large part for that, you know. So, you know,
Just do us a favour, because a lot of people will not know the derivation of your stage name. El Fresh, the line. Give us the breakdown.
Yeah, I'll do the short story because it's like a essay version.
Yeah, do the
as
short
well.
one.
But I'll do the short one.
Big panel.
Yeah, Fresh
Short version.
Fresh is an acronym, so it stands for Forever Rising, exceeding sudden hardships, which is why it always appears in caps. And that was my appropriation of a name that a classmate gave to me as a rapper in high school. He kept saying, you know, your music's fresh, it's cool. So I was like, okay, let me take it, redefine it, make it my own. So it became the acronym. And then it became El Fresh. I wanted the L to stand for lion. Lion coming from Sikh tradition, where men have the middle name or surname Singh, which translates into lion. Women have Kaur, which means royalty. So I wanted to use that. But then I was like, at some point, hip hop is not subtle, so like no one's gonna know what the L is. So I was like, just make it El Fresh the Lion, and make it a statement. So, you know, like, but as I was saying, you know, diving into music, and specifically hip hop music for me, enabled me to build confidence in myself. And so, you know, now when I'm talking to next generation artists who are coming out, whether it's kids from Western Sydney, Southwest Sydney, whatever it might be, or across the country, one thing that I try to articulate is, you know, no one wants to see an imitation or hear an imitation. We all have our influences when it comes to music. You know, we were all mentioned some of our influences before, and inevitably when we start making music, we're gonna sound like them. But at some point, you have to look inside and look at what your story is. What do you bring to the table, and what do you want to share with the world, and how can you express it in a way that is uniquely you? And when you do that, then you represent an authentic self, and you start being an imitation.
Thanks, Fresh. Next question is from Paul Hobkirk. We've got quite a few. We'll try and get through as many as we can. Go ahead, Paul.
Good evening. This question is probably going to take a bit of honesty to answer. I have a question more about the performance. Have you ever gotten bored singing the same material, you know, doing gigs day after day or week after week with the same set?
Tex.
Yeah, well, there are means and ways to look at something fresh, and alcohol is one of them. Marijuana's another. These things help. You get a new perspective. No, I'm not encouraging either of those things, of course, but yes, that's what. Well, personally, that's why I keep moving from project to project, and
it's a perennial problem for artists, isn't it? If you've got a back catalogue and people want to hear stuff you did 20 years ago, and they're standing there, probably alcohol's involved in this as well, yelling out that they want to hear that particular song.
Certainly, and I think, well, and there was a time, you know, where in my successful with the Cruel Sea days that. You know, we doggedly wouldn't play The Honeymoon Is Over, and people began to really, you know, react really badly. You know, again. So you've got to throw them a bone. Yeah. You're, and actually, you go through different feelings about it. You come to terms with it, and you go, you know. And
I've seen Van Morrison.
You fall out of love with these songs.
Van Morrison do an entire set with his back to the stage because he was so sick of doing his own songs.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's Van. That's Van. But
no, that's not good. That is him.
You fall out of love with your own music, and then you give it a rest, and that's why you keep writing new stuff. And
Yeah.
but yeah, of course you've got, you know, there are reasons people come to see you, and like
Having said all of that, can I just ask you if you'll play Whenever It Snows for us in the green room later?
I'll recite it.
Okay, mate. Very good. Next question's from Wendy Weir.
Australians love music. 97% of us listen to recorded music. More than half of us attend a live event every year. We're the 8th biggest music market in the world, and 1 in 7 of us is a music maker, whether they play an instrument or they compose or so on. Yet our levels of public investment are considerably lower than many other countries. So you think of somewhere like Sweden, for example, which is a net exporter of music, because music is woven into life at a really early age and at minimal cost through public education. So I'd like to ask the panel, what do you think needs to change so that we can really harness and maximise those powerful economic, social and cultural benefits of Australian music?
Start with Katie.
That is such a great question. Thank you very much. I'm firmly on your team and your way of thinking. Yeah, I actually was just chatting about this with Jonathon a little bit earlier, and I do have a few little stats here. But basically, I think for a long time, Australia has had a problem with valuing our music and realising how integral it is to us as a people, to us, to our understanding, to our sense of social cohesion, to our sense of belonging. All of the wonderful intangible assets, but the tangible assets are also incredibly important, and the economic benefits of the arts industry in Australia is something that just doesn't seem to be talked about enough. The fact is that in, I think, the 17-18 year, the arts culture in Australia gave back, you know, contributed over almost $112 billion to our federal budget, to our federal economy, which is 6.4% of our gross domestic product. However, the funding in the arts in Australia is approximately 1% of the government spend. So there's this huge disparity between what the arts give back to our culture economically, but of course all the intangible ways. And the other fact is that we employ almost 600,000 people, which is 5.5% of our workplace. Yet again, only 1% investment comes back into this incredibly important culture. So I think there's a fundamental problem with appreciating our culture and how much it gives to us in tangible and intangible ways. It's been a pretty dire decade, and actually the federal government now invests almost 20% less per capita in each Australian person. That's an inexcusable statistic.
So you're saying a decade, so it didn't get any better when Peter Garrett was in cabinet?
No, and well, the last 6 years particularly, since the coalition came in, it's been a particularly, and you know, I was on here with Brandis a few years back, and it was a tricky time, and thankfully we have a new arts minister who I think hopefully will be, you know, I'd love him to make some changes and show leadership in arts policy in Liberal government, which generally perhaps isn't the case.
Well, they're going to be flush with money in the next budget. Maybe everything will change.
Well, the thing is, I think we just don't appreciate the economic return. Like, even if you just want to talk on straight economics, aside from all the intangible, like mental health, social inclusion, you know, all the wonderful intangible things, the hard facts are we bring a huge amount of money, and also the export value. I think it's about 200 million a year export from the music sector alone outside of Australia.
Okay, let's go. I'll take this around the panel. Jonathon, what do you think? You've put a lot of thought into this, I know.
Look, I think there are issues around the language of the word art or arts in this country. And pardon the pun, but I think we have a cultural cringe around that language, around the word art. And most people, I think, when you engage them in a conversation about the arts, they're thinking of the high-end arts like opera and ballet, symphony orchestras, etc. So somewhere in there's been a change for us. And I think I live in Melbourne, and it was very interesting over the last decade. Our arts portfolio has become a creative industry portfolio. All of a sudden, the word the arts has been sucked out of the language and the conversation. And we can't let that go I also think that we're very bad in the arts, strangely enough, as singers and musicians as well too, at speaking up about these issues. The sporting industry has been very, very good at research for many, many decades and being out there and talking actively and proactively about why we need sport and why we all need to be active and why we need to be healthy. But we've got to stop talking to each other and the converted, and we've got to start banging on doors more. We've seen, sadly, the passing of Richard Gill last year, who was not only one of the greatest musical minds this country's ever produced, but one of the greatest advocates for music education in this country as well too. And I don't think we can have this conversation really without talking about music education and what's happened to music education in this country as well too, and the issues that we have with not just funding. The funding isn't the issue. The funding is in the education and the training of teachers, and particularly primary school teachers going into the education system. We have many, many wonderful music teachers out there, and I'm not talking about those particular teachers, and thank God for the wonderful music teachers that we've all had in our lives, and the people that are now going to be looking after my children and your grandchild and our children as well too in the future. But I do think the real issue that we have is in the training of primary school teachers in particular at pre-service stage when they're being trained. Apparently, there are only something like 2 out of 3 primary schools, government schools in this country, that have a music program in this country. And the flip side to that coin is that while we only have 23% of primary schools that have a continuous music education program, we have the independent schools that have 88% of them have a music program. Now, that's fantastic, and we know that they can do it because they've got the funds to do that. But more than that, we have to look at why are they making the investment into music programs? Why is Wesley College in Melbourne spending $21 million on a brand new music centre? Why is Knox Grammar spending big money on developing new arts, wonderful arts buildings?
You're talking about a musical divide, aren't you? So
Absolutely.
On that, I'm going to bring in, you grew up in Dubbo, as we said earlier. What do you think about this idea of an emerging musical divide, public schools?
Tony, can I just finish that before we go on? I just want to finish what I was saying, that the reason that the independent schools are making this investment into music because they know it gives them an academic advantage.
Exactly, because they're smart.
And if they're smart, they've got the money, congratulations, that's fantastic, but they're smart enough to know that there's also the research, and we have all the proof now in the world
Undeniable.
to prove that music supports academic education, and that we need all of us, all the teachers out there. We're not going to give up on you. We're going to on behalf of Richard Gill.
Yeah.
That's my promise. I know it's Katie's promise.
Yeah.
Jonathon, thank you for insisting on keeping going. Finish off. That's an important point to finish off.
I just wanted to say that we have to pick up our game in terms of lobbying state and federal government, and we're not going to give up on that in terms of music education or music generally. So watch out, we're coming for you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Mojo, what do you think?
I think that, you know, both of these guys have made some incredible points, and I think they're very right. I think that Australia has, you know, through education, always had a focus on academia and sports, and the arts were never. I don't know. I feel like they don't get taken as seriously. Definitely not in regional Australia. I feel like in the cities, there's definitely more education for the arts. I was very lucky to have a musical education, but that wasn't, you know, I had to get private lessons outside of schools. You know, I had good music teachers at school, but they weren't supported by the system, I don't think. But that was also some time ago.
Yeah.
The system's failing our teachers, Mojo.
Yeah,
What's happening is
I believe that.
apparently out of a 3 or 4 year teaching degree, there's only about 17 hours of education that's happening for teachers that are going into schools and having to face children with 17 hours over a 3 or 4 year course. And what's happened systemically over the past 20 years, we've seen the erosion of training, of not only the opportunity for music programs to be implemented into primary schools and schools, it goes a step further than that, is that there is not enough training happening in music of the teachers, and it's not their fault. No. 20, or more years ago, when we had teachers' colleges, in New South Wales here, for example, you had about 200 hours of training over that. I'm sure there are probably some teachers in the audience, and I know there's lots of teachers out there watching this as well too. If we gave teachers 1 hour of training in pre-service in training, 1 hour a week over a 4-year course, that would give them 112 hours.
Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to have to cut you off on that point because we've got to move on. We've got so many questions to get to and questions about the industry as well. You're watching Q&A's Power of Music special. We've got a lot of questions, as I said, to get through. The next one comes from Ferdi Ibrahim.
I guess this is more aimed at Katie, and Tex. Which do you consider the lesser of the two evils? Record companies controlling the music industry and therefore the success or failure of recording artists, or the technology control one in which companies like Spotify and YouTube rule the roost, but where artists receive relatively minimal income through streaming?
Tex, start with you. It's a different world than the one you started in.
Yes, look, the record business has always been corrupt. It's always been exploitive of artists right from, right from the beginning. It's always, exploited artists. But record, we started when, when people actually still were happy to pay for music, and we've had to come to terms with with this shift. Where, I think the record companies are correcting a little bit. They seem to be, there's some growth happening. And believe it or not, vinyl is coming back, and believe it or not, streaming does pay a bit. But,
that song I referred to you earlier, Whenever It Snows, which is a beautiful ballad, 250,000 people downloaded it on Spotify. How much money do you actually get?
Really?
How much? Well, that's right. That'd be a huge hit, right? So how much money do you get?
Nothing. Oh, nothing of significance. This is the first time I've heard of this. Look, as a long-term artist, I think many of us have come to terms with the fact that we just want our music heard. And it's almost... technology has kind of destroyed the industry, but also it's made it easier for us to make music as well. So the costs have come down for making music. Yeah. So it's not as much... But
how do you make a living, Tex? You're a very well-known... You've got to go out on the road.
Basically, it's live. You want your music heard, and basically it's hopefully bums on seats.
OK, we'll come back to how hard that is in Sydney, for example. Fresh.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's an important question because, a lot of artists getting into the industry and people in the industry are still grappling with, how do I make this sustainable? And, there's now, it's like, it's almost like you can't just be good at one thing, you know what I mean? Or you're really good at one thing and that kind of leads you to be able to do multiple things, but you kind of have to have your hands in a bunch of different things. So, And
is that a temptation for you to go global? I know you're on Indian TV, 30 million viewers on their MTV Hustle last night.
Yeah.
So you're making connections with a very big market there. Do you see it in those terms as a kind of exporting your own talent?
Yeah, most definitely. Exports are important. Not just from a financial standpoint. For me, it's like going back to the motherland, so there's another connection there. But, I think as an artist, you just have to find multiple ways to make it happen for you. And you can't kind of rely on, traditional record sale model and also kind of streaming. You just have to find a way to build your artistry and develop it into a brand so that you can do multiple things. And so
I looked at your streaming figures as well on Spotify. You've got a couple of songs, Survive, 878,000 downloads. Another one, 759,000 downloads. Do you get actual money for that?
I mean, it contributes, you know, not a lot, but it contributes, you know, and when you're recouping a record that you've spent money making, you know, it all counts. There's other ways to do it, you know, for example, you know, I've got a partnership with Sydney Kings, which, you know, we're just about to announce. And, you know, that's another way for me to be able to make music and to be able to participate in something that I'm also passionate about, which is basketball, and also highlight Western Sydney. So, you know, like there's other kind of ways to kind of go about it. I mean, I've personally been able to sustain as a full-time musician for the past 3.5 years. So, you know, and finding ways to continue to grow the business is something that I'm constantly talking about with my manager, and export's a big part of that.
You think
I've got a new genre that we can create together, you and me. It's going to be called hip hopera.
You know, just on that, like, funny enough...
And we're going to take it to the world, and we're going to get 3,000 million hits.
There was an event...
I can tell.
There was an event in Southwest Sydney, Casula Powerhouse, called Hip Hop way back in the day.
Yeah.
Collaboration, man.
Yeah, totally.
It's key.
If I
Katie, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you so much for the question. When I started in the music industry as a young woman in my late teens, the digital revolution wasn't with us. It was the old model where the record companies were the gatekeepers to the careers of artists. And I'm so thankful that those times have changed. I've totally been embracing of the digital revolution. I think my band George, we were one of the first bands to have like a group chat forum page, which was cutting edge in the late 90s. But times were bad, but it's come back. And so that's due to a lot of amazing groups, of course, like APRA and lobbying of the government to bring down the piracy. There was an entire generation of young people who didn't believe that they should pay for music. And, you know, we live in a capitalist society. You don't get anything for free. So music should always be, there should be some return for what you hear. But the main gripe that I have is that when I listen to radio in Australia, I don't hear Australian music. And the majority, I think I was reading some stats from Dan Rosen's speech at Big Sound a few weeks ago where he said that on average we listen to about 18.3 hours of music a week, each Australian. 80% of that is on radio. And at the moment, the quotas that our radio stations are asked to fulfil is a measly 25% Australian content. None of the commercial radio networks meet those quotas. And even if they do, they don't
play
do
it late at night,
They
right?
do it at 2 in the morning.
Yep.
And so, whereas in Canada, it's 35%, and those quotas are always met. And the problem is, where do I hear Texas music? Where do I hear Claire Bowditch, Lior, Uncle Archie? You know, once you've outgrown the Triple J market, which is fantastic, but is a very young demographic, where do artists kind of... And unfortunately, streaming is very youth-obsessed, so...
Can I add to
which
that?
is
Like,
fine, but,
which
yeah.
touches on a previous question as well, you know, like, it goes back to that conversation about valuing Australian music, you know, it's like, if you go to the States, if you go to the UK, you know, what's on mainstream radio is their own music.
Yeah.
You know, they're not playing our stuff.
No.
But we're playing their stuff in bulk. And that's great. We enjoy it, you know. It's not to say I'm criticising other people's tastes and stuff like that.
We
but
make such great
we make
music
great
here.
stuff, man. Like,
This
it's
is
no better time to be
inexcusable.
a fan of Australian
I'll bring in
music.
Mojo. Just so streaming versus the old style.
Well, you know, I reckon I'm sitting here on this panel right now because my video went kind of semi-viral
Great video.
about a year ago.
Yeah.
So
YouTube.
YouTube is
Yeah.
a huge part of, has been a huge part of my career. Having said that, I've always existed on the fringes of, you know, the industry and kind of made my own way, and a lot of that has been through touring.
Yeah.
I've had a sustainable career for 10 years, but not a lot of people maybe here necessarily knew that. I've got my fan base, and you know, and they were there because we gigged our asses off for a really, really long time, and I think that still exists. That still exists, but I think with, you know, with streaming and the way those algorithms work, we can kind of have this global reach now, and I think that that's really exciting. So I think I'm like leaning towards, I think it's a good thing the way that technology is moving. Yes, we just needed some time to figure out how to make that work for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
But nothing takes away from the power of a live show. That's what
That's
it always
true.
comes back to, you know.
Let's move on. We've got a question from Milana Votrubek. Hi, Milana.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity of asking this. There's research that shows that people with dementia can regain some of their memory via music that they have been associated with. So people who grew up in the 60s associate with songs like Love, Love Me Do, or some silly little love songs, but that perhaps are meaningless in themselves, but they actually are tunes that people can whistle or hum to. So what with will the current generation who listen to hip hop and rap respond to when they age and lose their memory?
Tex, I'm going to start with you because can you imagine a time when, you know, many years from now, when you're sort of having to be inspired by listening to some tune, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. I listen to so much, so much different music, but I've been singing old people's music since I was 17. I've been preparing for the latter years of my career right from the beginning.
What are you talking about, Tex? We'll meet again?
Well, like I sort of started singing sort of country kind of music and sort of, you know, well, sort of a rough sort of version of it. So I don't know. It's you know, it's my full circle is waiting for me. You know, but I don't know. I think music has a lot of healing properties, and I think.
Have you seen? You've seen a specific example of that in the United States, haven't you?
Well, music, songwriting through therapy. There's a great country artist named Mary Gaucher who's released an album called Rifles and Rosary Beads, which was written with American war veterans who have come back with, you know, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and there's this whole program of songwriting for soldiers, and they pair up professional songwriters with you know, all these veterans, and I just think that could be applied in all sorts of trauma situations, you know, and I think there's a great healing, you know, in being able to, you know, share your experience, and I think that's what the bottom line about music is. It's music at its best. It's connection. It's empathy. It's you know, it's having a shared
universal language.
It's having a shared human experience, and that can be experienced, you know, in a dance party with 10,000 people all doing the same thing, and it can be experienced by an old, beautiful old country song that makes you feel like, yeah, I know that. You know, it's all about connection and empathy.
I'm going to go quickly to Fresh because the question. I think the question is dubious about the idea. There's going to be any rap songs that'll kind of fit the bill here because they don't have you know, melodies. They don't have melodies. So I want to hear from Fresh on this. So Fresh, 40 years from now, maybe you're in some sort of institution and. Maybe I'm just saying, what is it you're going to be wanting to hear?
Yeah, I'm going to be in my rocket chair.
Old rap at home.
I'm just thinking about that.
Yeah, no,
beard's a lot wider by then.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that day. Yeah, most definitely. I think, you know, the question speaks to, like, moments. You know, like, music brings us such meaningful moments that we connect to and relate to at different points in time in our lives, and we relive those moments as we get older, you know, and it takes that one moment or melody or word or whatever it might be to trigger that, you know, and hip-hop definitely has those moments. Like, we're not at, I mean, it's such a young, you know, culture / genre, I suppose, of music compared to others, so I think we will, you know, we will inevitably have that, but it, like Tex was saying, music hits you, you know, it speaks to you in that way, and you know, we will have those moments. And
got an anthem in mind that you might want to hear over?
Yeah, I mean, for me,
bring you back to life.
For me, it would be Tupac Shakur's "Changes," you know, which is, you know, it's such a meaningful song, but even the chorus of that is so melodic and samples a particular record that has such a great melody too. And that's the other thing about hip hop, you know, it's born from a sample culture. So, you know, it samples a lot of old records and reappropriates them So those familiar records that you're talking about guarantee have been sampled in hip hop. And you know, like
I just love the sound of this hip hop nursing home. It's
yeah, let's make it happen. Hey, totally, we onto something.
Can I mention though, hip hop was born in the late 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you know, there's going to be people in nursing homes
Oh yeah,
sooner than you think.
Yeah,
Gotta listen to
They're there now.
Can I just speak to hip hop though? I think what people of older generations, if I can say that, being one of the kind of senior statesmen on the panel, hip hop, when you listen to it, is poetry. It's beautiful poetry, how it's written. I've got 2 boys now, 10 and 12, and we've been listening to Mojo and Elfresh's music this last week, and you know the boys are totally into it and they get it. But I think what we forget is that the music, there's the music side of it, but the language in particular is poetic. And it's rhythmic as well too. And that's something that's also been proven through research. And there are many, many wonderful examples now of how music is changing lives for so many people in all walks of life. There are now choirs for people who have had aphasia, who have had strokes. And I speak of one particular choir in Melbourne that I know of, Stroke Accord, that I believe when it started, you know, 23 out of the 25 people couldn't speak, but they could sing. Because we're now discovering through this research, all the research is there for us in the world. There's an ocean of it now to prove how music changes our brain and the fantastic feel-good hormones that are released, like oxytocin, which is a hormone that when you're mother and child, it's that bonding hormone that is created, which creates trust. When we sing together as people, that's what occurs. And in fact, one of the new choir projects I'd like to create is in Parliament House in Canberra. And I have 2 alternative names for it. Choir of Hard Heads or Sing for Your Super. I'm not quite sure, but
Hey, Jonathan, I know that you've got a kind of experiment that you can actually do with larger
this
audiences.
relates-
I just heard these people clapping, so give us a sense of how rhythm works.
Well, rhythm, I mean, one of the most wonderful things, and again, it comes back to research, there's now a direct correlation between rhythm and music and language, and in particular in preschool children, how rhythm and music can be taught to help aid rhythm in language, because it's about reading symbols, particularly when you move to reading music and you're taught to read music. As when you're reading a book, there are letters and sounds, and the symbols and sound basically is how it works, and how those things work together too. So I'm going to do this rhythmic. Are you ready? You up for this, audience? Okay, I'm going to stand up and do this. So that I'm just letting my...
Reminding me of Richard Gill right now.
Oh, bless.
This is our Richard Gill Memorial audience participation.
I'm not going to
moment.
make you sing, okay?
Oh, why
But you need
not?
to have your hands free. If you can have your hands free. Look at me, look at me. Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to clap a rhythm to you. I'm going to do something and I want you to clap it back to me. I'm going to go first. When I say go, you go. So I call this rhythmic dictation. You ready?
Yes.
Here we go. Me first. Go. Do it and go. Some of you are a little confused when you did that. I'll keep it a bit simpler. I'm going to do a combination of kind of rhythms and sounds now. Ha ha. Wee, wee, whoop. Go. Ha ha. Wee, wee, whoop. Good. Excellent. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this 4 counts in front of you. Gentlemen in the audience and at home, it's called multitasking. Ready? So I'm going to do 4 claps. I'm going to keep going. You're going to be watching what I've done while you're doing what has already come up.
And this is going to be the last one, Richard.
Yeah. Here we go. Me first. You ready?
Yes, we're ready.
Show me the. Here we go. Me first. Go. Keep going. You did it!
Seriously.
What we had happening there was, can you imagine what's going on in your brain? You know, it's all this really feel-good stuff that's happening. We've got endorphins being released. We've got serotonin, which is used in antidepressant drugs. When we make music together, we've got the research to prove this. And what is my bugbear, I really, really want to see more funding in what I'm going to call community music in particular, and all these therapeutic arts now that we're seeing amazing results. I've been involved in some research with University of Queensland over the last couple of years.
I'm going to interrupt you because the lockout laws are going to come into play.
Okay.
We're all going to get caught. We're going to hear Dave Roberts' question. So let's hear from Dave.
Thanks, Tony. As a working musician, I can confidently say that the scene here in Sydney is frankly embarrassing. Another live music venue closed today, leaving only a small handful left in Sydney for up-and-coming bands and acts to play in. How do you think we in the industry and those external to it can go about revitalising and reinvigorating the music and arts scene here in Sydney? And what do you think it will take for Sydney to be a global player in this scene once again?
Tex, I'll start with you because you remember what it was like when this was the capital of live music in Australia.
Well, the only answer I can think of is going back to Brisbane, where there was nowhere to play. I started in like 1981, and someone would have the courage to put on music at a pub, and it'd become a venue, and then someone would complain, and it'd shut down, and there was a series of that. So we learnt to put on our own. We found halls to hire, and we took it in our own hands, and we created this tiny little scene, where there was less than 100 people. So, I mean, I think at some stage you've got to, start, doing it yourself. If that's not too big a task.
Yeah.
If Sydney is that barren, then I think you'll hire a hall.
Well, we are sort of going to see the end of some of the lockout laws. Fresh, what do you reckon? You moved to Melbourne. Is it part of the reason?
No, that wasn't part of the reason. Man, I empathise with you greatly because, it's tough in Sydney, especially as an up-and-coming artist, Now, I remember having a conversation with my label, some of my people at Elephant Tracks, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and, saying to them, at that particular point in time, it would have been very difficult for me to go out and tour in the way that I had done in the past because the scene had changed so much, particularly in Sydney. And, the conversations I've had with emerging artists as well from Sydney, some of them say, I think I need to move to Melbourne because that's going to afford me more opportunities to play live shows. Sydney just doesn't have the live culture that it used to. And it's sad. It really is sad because we're producing so much talent in Sydney, And, just to add to that conversation as well, specifically in Western Sydney, at Big Sound Music Industry Conference that just happened earlier on in September, I would go so far as to say I reckon 75 to 85% of the hip-hop and R&B acts that play were from Western Sydney, But there's nowhere to play in Western Sydney. There's no venues that they would want to play at that would regularly host gigs that, would make it possible for them to develop their live show. So, it's a real challenge in Sydney right now. I don't know the answer. I mean, Tex kind of touched on it a bit. When you have a will, sometimes you kind of just have to make it happen by any means necessary, however you possibly can. But that's so much easier said than done, and it's tough, man. So I think, there's got to be some sort of policy reinvigoration for sure, and I hope that's coming because, Sydney took a shot in the arm and the leg, and, it's struggling to get back up.
I'm going to quickly move on because it's time for one last question, I think. Well, maybe we'll have one after this, but this one's anyway from Brooke Tunbridge.
Hi. So what else do you think needs to happen to ensure that live music venues are a safe and inclusive place, free of harassment?
Yeah, Katie.
Oh, wow. That's a very big question. I don't think it's necessarily related to music. I think it's probably more related to drinking and, other elements that are at play. I think... Can you be a bit more specific? Like, what do you mean exactly? Like, what makes going to a pub or going to a music gig? What's the difference?
There's been a lot of stories about women being sexually harassed during gigs, so by audience members.
Right. I'm not really able to comment on that. Yeah.
I feel like I have been thinking of something like along these lines, and I've been talking a lot with my agent recently about things like inclusivity riders, which I think might kind of play into this a little bit. So for those of you that don't know, a rider is like what you request. Like, so you might have a hospitality rider that says what kind of food and drinks you want backstage, or a tech rider that says what kind of backline equipment you need provided for your performance. So I'm in the process of putting together an inclusivity rider that kind of, I guess, includes things like gender neutral bathrooms, diversity amongst staff, security staff, a point person for, you know, LGBTIQA people, a point person for people of colour, to, in the instance if there is harassment or those types of things, that they can go there. Also things like accessibility and visibility for, like, you know, viewing platforms for people who might not be able to see otherwise, or these kind of things. And I think that plays into it, making sure that, like, as an artist, that the place that you're going into has a protocol in place for when things like this occur, that there is, you know, it shouldn't be on us as artists, it should be on venues and the spaces or festivals or whatever who should be on. But I think as artists, and I think Jonathon mentioned this before, we've never unionised as musicians, and we maybe haven't been so good at sort of speaking up about certain things, but I think that's changing. And I think maybe collectively, by kind of expressing a need and a want for that within our industry, creating safer spaces, that we could actually affect that kind of change.
Tex, does the industry have to take a look at itself in regards to sexual harassment?
I think creeps and predators are everywhere. I mean, they're going to operate on. I think a crowd is, you know, is a good environment for them to get away with it. You know, inappropriately being too close to, you know, or like that could happen on a bus. You know, and so, but yeah, an awareness of it by security, or like it's got to be called out, and they've got to be, you know, called out and shamed when it's, you know, but it's a hard one to pinpoint, really, because it's so underhanded that it's you know, sometimes it's very, you know, sneaky in its nature.
You know what, I'm going to leave it there so we can come back on a high note, because you're going to perform for us in a minute. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel: Jonathon Welch, Tex Perkins, Mojo Juju, Katie Noonan and Elle Fresh the Lion. Mojo, that's your cue.